Welcome to the Innovation Brief, the podcast where we have real conversations with leaders driving meaningful change across diverse sectors. I'm Gaby Hernandez. Each episode, we bring you insights from innovators who are shaping the future through bold ideas, fresh perspectives, and transformative work. Today, we're excited to be joined by someone who has made a global impact on sustainable development, particularly for islands around the globe. Our guest is James Ellsmoor, an award-winning serial entrepreneur, writer, and the CEO of Island Innovation. James has worked with islands on every continent, championing renewable energy, conservation, and climate action. He's the founder of the Virtual Islands Summit, a groundbreaking initiative that brings together island leaders to share solutions and spotlight their role at the forefront of sustainability. He's also a Forbes columnist, an international speaker, and a trusted advisor on how systems like energy, tourism, and oceans intersect to shape resilient futures. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a policymaker, or simply curious about how islands are leading the charge in tackling some of the planet's biggest challenges, this conversation is packed with insights you won't want to miss. So let's dive in. Welcome, James, and thank you for joining us. Could you please start by telling us about Island Innovation? What problem are you trying to solve? And what inspired you to dedicate your career to supporting island communities and ecosystems?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Gaby. It's a pleasure to be here. So, Island Innovation really started with an idea that wherever an island is in the world, there are certain characteristics they share in common. Obviously, we're talking about a very wide-ranging group of places geographically, culturally, economically, but there are certain commonalities as well. And so with the advent of improved communication technologies, we can, bridge the defining fact of islands, which is isolation on some level, to actually share ideas. Instead of trying to replicate ideas that have been pushed on mainlands, we can say, okay, this island has solved waste management, which is a huge issue for many islands, or tourism, or blue economy. And there are all these connecting points. And so really our approach has been to share ideas. We're a platform that brings together this range of islands from the Caribbean to the Pacific, to the Mediterranean, to the north of Europe, and really tries to share ideas. And so the initial concept came from that and my own personal interest in traveling to different places and seeing the opportunity for sharing this. And I think the name Island Innovation comes from the fact that by definition, islanders have to innovate. If you don't have all the resources available, you have to figure out new ways of doing things and work with what you've got. And so that was really the inspiration for starting this organization. We're now a group of 16 people, all working remotely from different places, different islands around the world to support this mission.
From your perspective, what makes islands such powerful testbeds for innovation, particularly in sustainability, climate adaptation, and resilience, as well as what lessons should the rest of the world be paying attention to?
So islands are really on the front line when it comes to climate change. I think that's well known, but also with economic and cultural challenges as well. Trying to preserve unique cultures and trying to survive economically are also things that islands are facing every day. So we look back to COVID, for example, when there was a global halt in travel. Some of the worst affected regions in the world were islands that economically depend on tourism. And obviously, there's a whole conversation around tourism and the pros and cons we can go into. The reality is that tourism is a key economic pillar for many, if not most, islands. As I mentioned before, this idea of necessity-driven innovation is really key. And so showing solutions, but also being realistic with the limited capacity. If you have only so many people, you're not going to have expertise in every area. And so trying to share expertise between different islands also becomes really important. So islands can primarily learn from each other, and that's our primary goal. But also I think it's important that if you are on the front lines, you're figuring out things that often will be problems for everyone else down the road. So when it comes to climate change, adapting to climate change, many islands are at the forefront of this. And the things that they work on, the solutions that they find, will have a wider relevance for the general population living on continental areas as well. So that's the philosophy that we approach, but also that because of those capacity constraints, often it's done on a shoestring budget. Often you're trying to make do with the resources you have available. And so that also in itself pushes change.
Definitely a lot of that resonating. I can familiarize, relate to a lot of those issues, especially coming from an island myself. Another major issue that islands face in terms is the oftentimes, because of their island nature, their remoteness and so on, they're oftentimes operate in silos, there's some disconnect and so on. But a lot of the work that you guys do at Island Innovation has been focusing on trying to build bridges between different governments, different NGOs, academia, the private sector. What insights have you gained about creating ecosystems of, collaboration and trust that others, both in and beyond islands, can maybe learn from?
Yeah, it's a critical one. I mean, obviously, we at the end of the day are outsiders coming in, and we don't come in with all the answers. That's not the point of Island Innovation. As I mentioned before, it's really about this platform to share ideas and try to, I guess, connect groups, individuals that are not connected. And so, whether it's the Cayman Islands or Fiji or Hawaii or Greenland, there are groups, individuals, governments, NGOs, academia working on various aspects of sustainable development. It's interesting that often, and this wouldn't necessarily have been my assumption when we started this work, but often we do that connecting within an island or an island group itself. It's surprising how often we get reached out. We have people reach out who are on the same island and don't necessarily know about other groups working on the same things they are on that same island. But obviously, if we can say, okay, in Cayman, there's a big need now to figure out the development issues that the islands are facing. So how have other islands already approached this problem? But what's known as the quadruple helix, so government, NGOs, academia, and the private sector, our approach is normally you need all four of those groups in some way to work together. And I think in an island context, that becomes even more critical. Normally, the government takes a lead because in small economies, the government tends to be a much higher percentage of the economy than compared to a large mainland area. But you need support from all those different groups. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question there, but I took a stab at it.
No, that's a great one. And you raise a really interesting point about how a lot of the connecting that you do is actually within the islands itself, because islands generally have smaller populations and, it's the presumption is more close-knit communities and so on like that. Maybe can you elaborate a little bit more about some of the lessons you've learned in helping to connect those island stakeholders and how you've overcome any challenges in that area?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. And obviously, we're also comparing a vast range of places. You have Pitcairn Islands that have 50 people, or Jamaica with 3-4+ million. So, on some level, of course, there is some generalization and there are going to be unique contexts in each of those. I think what often happens, though, and where we found that our role as a facilitator can be useful, is that yes, there are community connections and groups that people know each other, but in a way that can become very entrenched. And so people end up talking to the same people and not always spreading out the information. There's not necessarily a push to network when you have the assumption that you already know everyone. And so it's a different social pattern. You need to talk to a sociologist to get into that some more. But just in terms of our experience, sometimes those silos actually exist even on a very small island where you wouldn't think it would. That being said, of course, that one of the big benefits of island communities is that they have some level of community responsibility, community protection that benefits their society. So it's an interesting dichotomy, really, between those two things that I think do exist simultaneously.
So going on to the next question, you have the recent Virtual Islands Summit that you guys have organized, as well as you're organizing the upcoming Global Islands Summit to bring together different islanders and voices from across the globe. What themes or opportunities do you see as most urgent for innovation leaders, policymakers, and investors right now, particularly in island contexts?
Absolutely. So the Virtual Island Summit this year was 7 years that we've been running that. It came out as this unique or new concept, I should say, before COVID, when the idea of a virtual event was something different. Of course, now we're in a whole different world where we're very used to that kind of collaboration. But actually, it's easy to forget that pre-COVID, people didn't necessarily know what Zoom was or have that use. What I did find, though, interestingly, was that in many island regions like the Caribbean, because people were spread out and often working regionally, they were already ahead when it came to this kind of virtual collaboration, because you could not depend on having face-to-face meetings, and especially with the high cost of traveling around the Caribbean, people had already moved forward. So that's an interesting angle, I think. But obviously with that virtual element, what we can do is have a conversation about tourism, about sustainable development, about marine conservation, and bring in 4, 5, 6 speakers from very different contexts to share how they're approaching these different issues. So again, that's kind of the fundamental that we built the organization off. And of course, the prioritization of those issues varies between different islands. You have a very strong group, the Small Island Developing States, which are a group about a quarter of UN members, independent countries that are really, again, on the front lines of climate change and are working hard at the UN conferences, the COPs, to really push for that access to climate finance to field that adaptation. Where we as an organization recently have really focused is on subnational island jurisdictions, or SNIDGs, which encompasses a broad range of islands, often known as territories or regions or provinces. So again, you could look at the UK overseas territories like Cayman, US territories like Guam or Puerto Rico. They have all the characteristics geographically of small island developing states, but for historical reasons, often as former colonies or continued colonies, some would say, they are part of this larger state. So on the global stage, someone from Puerto Rico is considered as an American with an American passport. Someone from Cayman is considered as British with a UK passport. So how do they fit into this system? Because what often happens is they fall through the cracks. They can't access the funding that's allocated for small island developing states because on the UN system, they're considered part of this metropolitan country. But also often their metropolitan country doesn't pay that much attention and neglects them in different ways. So what we've really focused on is how can we help these islands that really need to find access to finance, falling through the cracks, to get hold and find ways to fund the adaptation that they need to do. Because for all islands everywhere in the world, climate change is a huge challenge and it affects the economy and the society. But funding the infrastructure needed to adapt to climate change is a question that's not really been solved yet.
100%. I guess, you kind of touched on a little bit about, particularly with these territories and so on, about the, legacy that a lot of islands have in terms of colonialism and so on, which kind of helps lead into the next question, which is, what does meaningful support for island-led innovation look like, particularly for local and indigenous communities? And how can, say, external partners and organizations avoid maybe, help and collaborate with these islanders whilst avoiding, unintentionally reinforcing the same power structures that have historically kind of held them back?
Yeah. And that's a huge question. I'll take a stab at answering our approach to it. But obviously a big question and a critical one for working with islands. I think, as I mentioned before, capacity is often a huge issue. So many islands do acknowledge that the external help is necessary, and maybe even help is not the right word, but external support is necessary in some way if you don't have all the resources locally. But that being said, you can clearly see when that external support is imposed, those projects don't succeed. And I've seen various examples of that decision making being led locally versus imposed from the outside. And it's also who benefits from these projects ultimately. So to answer that, often you hear islands described as labs, laboratories for innovation. That's a really interesting point in how that language is used. We avoid using the word lab because to me, that implies an external force testing and experimenting on, which clearly, when we think of colonial histories of many islands, is very problematic. So, for example, even rethinking that word to be a lighthouse is the term that I prefer to show that, yes, there is an innovation that can happen that can be beneficial for the continent. But ultimately, if those test projects are being used, they need to benefit first the islanders. Then if they benefit other people afterwards, then great. This kind of experimental language that you often hear is something that I really try and push back against, because those decisions, those projects need ultimately to be led. So again, that's kind of where we come in, really just to try and add resources, add knowledge and external perspectives that often can be really useful, because islanders may be trying to solve problems that have already been solved in a different context. So it's a different way of thinking about innovation as well. Is innovation thinking a whole new solution from scratch? Sure, it can be, but innovation can also be taking a solution that's been made in one place and just applying that in a new context and adapting that culturally, socially, economically to different contexts. So yeah, a really critical part, I think, for any project to be successful.
And I really love that term that you used, lighthouses, right? It's a much more apt kind of term for, what we hope to see, islands acting as. And we've actually seen some recent developments where islanders have been, a leading force in a major case. So the recent ICJ climate ruling, which was initially brought forward by a group of islander students. And it's been called a turning point for, vulnerable nations in helping to drive forward towards more climate justice and equity. How do you see this, kind of reshaping the balance of power, and what could become possible if islanders had more, equitable access to the tools and resources and networks that they need to really be those lighthouses, of innovation?
Yeah, I think the recent ICJ case really summarizes the moral leadership that islands can have. But that's been something that has been going on for decades, I would say. The islanders have been at the climate COPs, for example, calling for action. And so we know that islands and the Pacific Island students that really led this case exemplified that well. The people living on islands are ultimately not the cause of climate change, but are bearing the brunt of those costs. And so what many islands have done is also take an approach of leadership by example, saying, we know that reducing our carbon emissions is not going to have any major impact on the world in terms of global warming or climate change, but leadership by example is a really critical part of that. As it happens, things like renewable energy and other forms of leadership can also be considered climate adaptation as well. So often we have these two kind of the separation between what is adaptation and what is mitigation. I really believe that islands should focus all their resources on adaptation and not be pushed into mitigation when their emissions are negligible. But actually, a lot of adaptation is mitigation and vice versa. So sometimes that separation between the two is not necessary or even helpful. But yeah, I think the push made by many young islanders and a lot of the new platforms that have emerged for especially small island developing states and citizens of small island developing states to have a voice is really promising. And so it's exciting to see, this ICJ ruling, what will happen next, and to what extent countries or individual cases will be able to leverage that to move forward. Because it was a huge moment, but it's also really just the start of a long journey.
One of the biggest barriers that islands face in terms of helping them to actually be more resilient, to adapt to the challenges that they're facing and pursue their sustainable development goals is finance, right? How can climate and development finance be redesigned to unlock more equitable and investable opportunities for island communities?
Yeah, and the finance ultimately is what a lot of this conversation comes down to. And it's particularly a challenge for islands because not only is there a lack of finance available when you compare to larger countries or regions, but ultimately things are often more expensive when it comes to an island context. So the same project has additional costs that are not taken into account. Part of that is due to market size. If you're trying to do something on a small scale and you have fewer people to divide the fixed cost by, it is going to be more expensive. And often there's less competition between companies or providers. So one example of that, which you might not necessarily think of as a primary issue, but something like insurance. If you do a renewable energy project, that needs to be insured. If you do that project in, let's say, Mexico or Brazil versus St. Lucia or Barbados, you're going to have a very different landscape when it comes to insurance. So the whole finance of a renewable energy project could come down to something as simple as insurance that is just prohibitively expensive in an island context, plus all the additional costs of shipping, etc., that drive up the costs. And then the fact that the project, by definition, might have to be much smaller. So again, if a company is thinking about building a solar farm in St. Lucia versus Mexico, in Mexico, it might be able to go and build several farms, or all the cost of entering that market might be much higher. But in St. Lucia, there's going to be limited options. When that comes to local groups, the same thing applies. If you're an NGO or a local company and you're trying to get a loan or grant funding, there are just fewer options. So loans tend to be very expensive. The cost, much higher interest rate than you would have in Europe or in the US. And many grant funders do not make themselves available to SIDS regions or island regions. So there's multiple different areas that all together really make finance a difficult issue to tackle. There are different attempts to resolve this. And actually, some of those issues I mentioned are not island specific, but are global South Pacific. And so I think one of the most interesting leaders over the last few years has been Mia Motley from Barbados. The Bridgetown Initiative is really an effort to highlight the discrepancies when it comes to finance availability from the global North and the global South. And I think what's interesting about her approach is she's really focused, or the team, her and the team behind the Bridgetown Initiative, have highlighted a lot of issues that affect islands, but they know that to solve those issues, they have to get more allies involved, because the voices of islands, trying to resolve something like the World Bank, it's not going to happen overnight. So they've made this a global South issue, which means you have major countries like Brazil, like India, like South Africa backing that. Also has the fact that she's been able to get players like President Macron in France to back certain aspects of that. A lot of people thought they would never see it. So the Bridgetown Initiative ultimately looks at the fundamental inequities between the global North and global South when it comes to access to finance. Those systems were really built during decolonization, and a lot of the ways that the IMF and the World Bank and other of the Bretton Woods institutions work just continue to reinforce those patterns. So ultimately, until we tackle those issues, we are going to continue to see this gap in finance. Even the grant funding or the Global Climate Fund, all this work that comes out of the COPs, access to that funding is really important, but it's not going to solve the fundamental infrastructure problem that's behind all this, that keeps those inequities in terms of finance.
If you were advising investors and development partners, what long-term investment in, the people and institutions on islands would look like, and how does that translate into stronger, more resilient innovation ecosystems on the ground?
You're asking me the big questions today. I think it is hard to persuade investors to look at small island developing states. If you look at your return on investment and the risk, it's sometimes if it's a purely business decision, it can be hard. I say hard, not impossible, because on the flip side, there is often quite high returns for investors that can be made. And so there's a lot of the barriers, yes, they're financial, but they're also political and social. And kind of tackling all those together is really, really critical here. I'm not sure I'd be in a position to advise investors beyond that. But in terms of local groups, again, finding channels to bring in investment, you do have to be creative. I think a lot of islands are really looking to the diaspora to help bring in those funds. And so, for example, having a registered entity in somewhere like the UK or the US that can receive funds and help direct them to projects focused on countries, that can be a big win. You know, a lot of foundations, they will only make grants to, let's say, a US registered organization. So if you don't have access to that, you cannot receive funds. But once that fund has been received by a US organization, there may be then ways to help direct that to projects benefiting islands. So, you know, depends on whether we're talking about private investment or about philanthropic investment. There is an interest in philanthropy for island regions. I think often, if you're persuading philanthropic foundations, you know, the impact that can be had in island regions is often far more visible and tangible in a way that can appeal to them. But still, the lowest rate of, you know, the least philanthropic funds available in the world is the Caribbean as a region. So there's a lot of different components here that come together.
I know that a lot of the work that you guys do is actually with, government stakeholders and so on. Policy is a critical enabler for innovation. Where have you seen governments create enabling environments that support local leadership and innovation? And what lessons could other islands or even larger nations learn from these examples?
Yeah, look, I think that government is my perspective, especially for islands, government is critical. You need the government to create that space. I mean, for many islands, the government could be 50% up to 80% of the economy, especially in the Pacific region, which tends to be very heavily aid driven with a smaller private sector compared to other regions. You know, government is critical for that. I think there's also a big role for regional organizations. Governments are going to have limited capacity. And so you see organizations like the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the OECS, does a great job to share resources and coordinate resources. In the Pacific, you have SPREP, the South Pacific Regional Environmental Program, which does a similar job focused on environment. And so that regional approach is really critical. If we look at SIDS, that often means that I think the Caribbean and the Pacific have that structure, but the other SIDS in Africa and the Indian Ocean don't necessarily have that regional structure. They're divided up by language, geography, other areas. And there has been a recent attempt to try and create that regional structure to benefit those islands, but definitely it's different to the Caribbean and the Pacific. That can be things, OECS that I mentioned, for example, does a lot around medications and helping to bulk buy medications and to reduce costs of healthcare between the islands. So those things are really important. I'd love to see more happen on transportation. I think one element, and you will know this, in the Caribbean, it is so expensive to get between islands. It's far cheaper to fly to New York or London than it is to an island that you might be able to see from your own island, but can't physically get to. A lot of that is also, I mean, there are the airlines, but also the governments, I think, need to enable that, because if we can solve that transportation problem, then there will be much greater ease of doing business between islands and collaboration. But unfortunately, sometimes the competition beats the collaboration. Yeah, I think it's the regional organizations can really drive that. And depending on the size of the island, the government has a role to set the policy. But if you have, which is unfortunately the case in many islands, the volatility of government swinging between two different political parties, that can create a problem. So I think where policies can be done in a way that supersede party politics, that is also really critical, because if you have party politics that just mean that as soon as a new government comes in, everything gets thrown out and you're back to square one, ultimately that's damaging for everyone. And that's not necessarily unique to Ireland. You can look at the US or Europe as well. But I think that the effect is far greater on Ireland due to the outsized role of the government in setting the rules of play.
So one area of major interest for, a lot of islands and so on, and that you've been a strong advocate for, is renewable energy. From your vantage point, what are the most exciting clean energy and climate innovations emerging from island contexts? And how scalable are, the ones that you're thinking of beyond islands?
I'm going to challenge the presumption in the question a little bit, because I think we already have the technology. This is really critical. A lot of the time when we're thinking about renewables, it's positioned as this future technology or trying to invent new technology, but actually we have a lot of technology already that has not been deployed. And so the barriers are not necessarily the technology, but as we've discussed a lot, the finance or the policy or even the social adaptation needed to implement that. And renewables is a great example of this. There are some islands that have really moved forward with a high penetration of renewables. But even when on paper everything lines up in terms of economy and renewables would just be a cheaper option, ignoring the environmental benefits, just that, the economic benefits would work. A lot of islands have still lagged behind on that. Part of that could be the fact that the upfront capital investment to make that transition is just too high for the reasons we discussed before. Or it could be that, you have a utility company that's making a lot of money with the status quo and it doesn't want to see any change. That's also the reality in some places. But renewables, fundamentally in an island context, make sense economically. And as I mentioned before, they're not just mitigation and reducing carbon emissions, but they're a form of adaptation. Some really great papers were written about Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria that showed how renewable energy microgrids would make the island far less vulnerable to a future hurricane than the centralized fossil fuel-based system that it had and unfortunately mostly continues to have. So by decentralizing production of energy through renewables, we can really make islands more resilient. And I think that's the key argument that we have to make, unfortunately, and even more so in this year's political climate, I joke, but with around climate change is becoming less of a political priority. But we can make economic arguments that actually we should go with renewables anyway. And so, I would say there are some, interesting examples like the Azores and the Canary Islands in Europe that are really moving far ahead with that. There's a number of Caribbean territories that have also moving ahead with that. And in the Pacific, you have some where most of the outer atolls have already moved entirely to renewables. Tuvalu is a particularly extreme example of a remote nation, but they've actually already moved the majority of their production to renewables for the economic benefit. So it's moving in the right direction. It's more about how can we facilitate that to move more quickly, I would say.
If you could paint a picture of island innovation in 2030, what does success look like?
Good question. So right now, as an organization, we kind of balance the services that we provide with the media platform. So often we're contracted by island governments, organizations to help accelerate the work that they're doing. We're doing a lot now with EU-funded work. Interestingly, the European Union has an island strategy, which is coming out next year, where they'll really look at how they can support the development of all islands across the political federation. And so that has been a really critical part of our work, because I think that until recently, the EU has really prioritized renewable energy for that. So we're doing a lot of work in the EU. I would say the two strongest regions that we have teams based and do work in would be the Caribbean and the EU. But we're also trying to expand that to have more of a presence on the ground in the Pacific and African islands. Part of the challenge, of course, is that we can't have a presence on the ground everywhere, which is why the virtual technology is important. And also we have our annual in-person meeting that next year will be the fourth year, where we try and bring that community together. So this year we had an amazing Global Sustainable Island Summit in St. Kitts and Nevis in partnership with the government there. The government really has an exciting vision for how it wants to have sustainable development as the economic bedrock for the island's future. And so we were really pleased to have the conference hosted with them to showcase what they're doing, but to also bring in other islands to visit and learn from them. Next year, we're going to Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands. So a very different context in many ways, much bigger island, not an independent state like St. Kitts and Nevis, but also on the cutting edge when it comes to renewable energy research, especially, and dealing with a big challenge on tourism. As you might have seen, Spain is going through a very tumultuous period when it comes to its relationship with tourism. And I think Gran Canaria exemplifies that, somewhere that economically, unfortunately, is still very dependent on tourism, but also a form of tourism that can be quite damaging socially and doesn't necessarily provide the economic return that it should. So they're grappling with how to acknowledge that tourism has to exist in some form, but that the current form of tourism is not working on many levels. So a lot of interesting challenges in Gran Canaria. We're bringing about 500 people there for the Global Sustainable Island Summit, which will be a very exciting opportunity to have these conversations in person, which, as much as I love the virtual collaboration, sometimes that in-person touch just really helps to accelerate projects and enthusiasm and opportunities.
And, for our listeners, many of them who are innovation leaders themselves or policymakers, investors in the space, what role do you think that they can play in helping to support innovation across islands?
Absolutely. Well, I think if you don't know much about islands and you're learning from it from this podcast, then I think education is really key. So thank you for, spending the time to learn. We're always learning more and more about how different islands are approaching this, but also helping to solve some of these financial challenges, looking at ways to drive that investment for projects, I think is going to be critical. So anyone who's listening, we would love to see you join us in April next year in Gran Canaria to contribute new ideas around the technologies that can be implemented, solving those financial challenges, and also getting over some of the political, regulatory hurdles necessary.
Amazing. James, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Before we go, what's next for you, and how can our listeners, learn more about your work, support it, and connect with you to further?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, we have our upcoming conference, which we'd love to see you at, but also you can follow us on Instagram, on LinkedIn. We also do a weekly bulletin of island news that you can sign up for on our website, islandinnovation.co. And we'd just encourage you to read that, to learn. What we really try and do is take as many stories from around the world to share that information. And if you're working on an interesting project on an island, then please do send it to us so we can try and share that with our community. Coming up very soon is also COP30. So we'll be doing daily bulletins during COP30 around what that means for islands and the specific challenges. As we discussed, much of that around finance that will be coming out of that. So if you're interested in the climate COPs, that will be a useful resource to learn more.
Thank you, James, again for joining us and sharing your wealth of experience and knowledge in the island innovation space. If you enjoyed this conversation, please be sure to subscribe to the Innovation Brief and don't forget to leave us a review. It helps other innovation enthusiasts discover the show. We'll be back next time with another great conversation. This has been the Innovation Brief. I'm Gaby Hernandez. Thank you for listening.